day viewers. So this is another little look at an antique broadsword that has fallen to my lap. And this one's a really interesting one. This is a sort of fairly early clan era broadsword. And we're going to compare it to a sort of later military broadsword and talk a little bit about what is the appropriate sword for the appropriate historical source, which is something I think is rather important. So let's have a look at the sword. So I'm going to start with this one, which is a Regimental era Highland broadsword, so made around about 1796. It's shade over 33 inches from cross to tip of the blade. It weighs barely a kilo. It's very, very light. And you can see that blade is very, very thin and quite flexible, like it will wobble when I wave it back and forth like that. The basket is just big enough, okay? My knuckles do touch it a little bit there. It's quite tight, but it is just big enough, and it's pretty standard type of basket on these military swords for the period. The pommel is quite small, which means that it does not dig into my wrist there, which is a mistake some people make, is that they make these sort of pommels too big and they stick out, and they forget that the real ones actually had like resin to round them off. They just leave them as a sharp edge and it digs into your wrist, and that's wrong. This one doesn't have that issue. The grip is slightly restrictive insofar as I can form a hammer fist for parrying, I can shift to a handshake grip for the full extension of the cut, but that's about as far as I can go. There's no way of dropping the point any lower to do any thrusting without bending my wrist and breaking the wrist like that, which is a definite no-no. So this is a cutting sword, definite cutting sword. If I compare it to something that you might be a bit more familiar with, such as this 19th century military broadsword, honestly, in terms of weight and feel, they feel about the same. This also is barely a kilo, and moves in a very similar way. The big differences in design, if we can look at them, is the blade profile of this one. It's still thin up in the cutting third, but you've got this very, very thick back from about there downwards. So 2/3 of the blade, which means it's much thicker and it's much stiffer, and therefore designed much more for the thrust, whereas this one is obviously thin all the way and designed for slicing and cutting. And the grip reflects that. There's not as much protection around the hand, but it does allow me to shift down to a thrusting grip whenever I so desire. And in both cases, the sword is easily light enough that I can just swing it around using a wrist motion only, okay? So no need for any fancy body mechanics. It's just round the wrist. And so if you were doing something like weight, this would be a perfectly adequate sword to use. If you're doing Angelo, Taylor, Roworth, again, something like this is exactly the right sort of weapon to have. But this is what I really want to show you, is what happens if we look at an earlier era, clan era type broadsword. So as you can see, this is a completely different beast, okay? This one is early to mid 17th century. It's got this massive broad Scots blade on it, which is, it's just huge. The blade itself is German. There is a little running wolf mark on one side of the blade. There's something inscribed on the other side, but that's gone, so who knows, it's unreadable at this stage. It is 32 and a bit inches from cross to tip, so just a shade shorter than the other one, nothing much in it. But a huge difference in weight, okay? This one weighs a massive 1.4 kilos, and it's quite forward weighted with that, okay? The balance point is at least 12 centimeters from the cross, and in the hand, you immediately feel that, okay? It wants to swing through and cut. The blade is still quite thin, okay? And again, quite flexible, and wobbles a little bit again when I do that. The basket is... It's nicer than the other basket, that's the first thing to say. Okay, it's kind of globular shaped, so it comes in sort of around the top of my hand like that. I'm not touching any part of that basket at all when I've got my hand in there, but there's certainly no wasted space. It's not some massive over-engineered thing as we tend to get these days. Pommel is solid, it's paned over at the end. These two bars are just sitting alongside the pommel, they're not attached, which is really common with broadswords. This one is just riveted to the pommel there. An interesting feature of the grip is this, in that it's big enough that I can, again, hammer fist it for parrying, I can handshake it at the full extension of the cart, but the basket also contains these two little extensions. They kind of bow outwards. What that allows me to do, should I so want to, is extend my thumb into there while keeping it safe behind a piece of steel, which means that I can, in fact, drop this point down and to a thrusting position with keeping my wrist nice and straight. So in theory, I could thrust with this, which is really interesting. Whether or not that is the purpose of those little things or whether it's just a happy accident, who can tell? But interesting feature that was pointed out to me. Now, the real point of showing you this is that there is no way I can swing this sword around my wrist in that sort of regimental 19th century style. It's way too heavy. Okay, it's good for silver, so does that really nicely. Okay, so I can use the sort of, silver-esque medieval style full body weight movements. If I want to fight from here, I've really got to employ page-like full body mechanics in order to control the thing. And as you can see, if you do that, it moves really nicely. But it is a full body motion. It is not just swinging it around your wrist because it's just too heavy. So I've talked before about the need to pick the right broadsword for the system that you are doing, and I thought it would be interesting to see historical examples of exactly what I was talking about. Roworth Taylor, nice, light, 1 kilo-ish, a blade that's nice for fencing, is exactly what you want, totally appropriate for something like that. If you want to do earlier styles, earlier systems, you're going to need a more substantial broadsword because they really are different weapons, even though they're both basket-hilted broadswords. And the other thing that's probably worth pointing out is while this is nice and light and very thin and sharp, and I'm sure, I could do a lot of damage to somebody with that. I could probably kill them if I hit them with a nice accurate cut. There's absolutely no comparison in terms of stopping power. Okay, if this failed to cut you, if it, hit the gold sovereign in your pocket, or you're wearing a heavy woolen greatcoat or something like that and it doesn't penetrate, it's hardly going to leave a bruise. It's just too light. This thing is, it's designed to cut people in half, and would easily smash bones even if it doesn't cut through something. This is a really serious battlefield weapon that is designed to stop somebody with one good blow. There is, like I say, they're just very, very different swords. So I thought you would be interested in seeing that. I do plan at some point to do some test cutting with this once I find a medium that is worthy. So you will see it again, but in the meantime, that is the Clan era broadsword as opposed to the Regimental era broadsword. So, beautiful sword, and you will definitely get to see that again at some point. Now, just finally, to satisfy the curiosity of an interested viewer, the beer today is this one. So this is Endeavour Amber Ale. Endeavour Brewery is based down at the Rocks in Sydney, actually just a stone's throw from where the Rocks branch of Staccato meets, at least before the the pandemic shut it down, but we'll be back at some point. So when we do go back, we might track down the brewery and have an after class visit, perhaps. But anyway, it is good, hearty winter beer, my favourite of the locally available amber ales. So I hope you found that bit interesting too.